This Choircast podcast is brought to you by Heretic 2 by Matthew J. DiStefano. Ready to challenge everything you thought you knew about faith? In Heretic 2, I dive into LGBTQ affirmation, rejecting divine violence, and embracing universalism in a bold post-Christian perspective. If you're done with outdated dogma and want a justice-oriented, inclusive view of spirituality, then this book is for you. Get Heretic 2 wherever books are sold and start rethinking faith today. This Choircast podcast is brought to you by High Minds. Join host Andy Colenso and Matthew J. DiStefano as they tackle culture, justice, spirituality, and all the big questions shaping our world. High Minds isn't about talking points or hot takes. It's about deep, insightful conversation that inspires and challenges. Tune in to explore new angles, question the status quo, and elevate your thinking. Listen to High Minds wherever you get your podcasts.
This is Radical Love Life, an ongoing series of conversations with thought leaders exploring faith outside the boxes. Hosted by Mark Dilcom and Kelly Wilson.
Hey, Mark.
Hi, Kelly.
How are you today?
I am awesome. In fact, I'm freaking awesome, even though I have a kind of a head cold. It's a good way to start off 2025 as we're recording this episode. But, they say having a bad head cold for the New Year's is really good luck for the new year. So,
well, that's an aphorism I'll start to pass around because I do hear.
Yeah, please do.
Yes,
Yes, exactly. It feels great to me, or certainly it pacifies the fact that I have this cold. But I truly am freaking awesome. It's been an amazing holiday. My mom was with us throughout the Christmas season. We inured, which is a word I learned. This is when you take the cremains of somebody and put them into their space. Inurnment, not internment.
Oh,
we did that with my dad.
Because terra is earth, so interred would be in the earth.
In
and then
internment, we put my dad's ashes into our niche, family niche at St. John the Divine before Christmas, which was really special to us. That's where our family,
that's really sweet.
We bought several spaces there. So that's really great. He's been gone for, what will be almost 13 years, but we finally found a place to put him. So,
well, that sounds like a very sweet yet somber way to start the new year. But
yeah. How about you? How was your holidays?
We had a very good holiday. It was all around the house. My in-laws came out and we got to spend a little time with them. And, Christmas morning, it's when your kid is 15, it's not quite the same as when they're 10. Like, it's not like, hey, everybody get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. It's more like, hey, it's noon. Do you want to get up so we can,
we want to open our presents?
Right. Which I like, actually, because it's, to me, the way that Americans do Christmas is such an anticlimax. Like, there's this huge buildup from Thanksgiving all the way up, and then there's this one day, and there's lots of stuff, and that's like it's done.
Yeah.
But we
don't do Christmas well. I mean, and it's one of those things that I've learned even because we don't celebrate Advent. I'm not here to go out against it, but even with folks who have an Advent calendar, they really know what the 24 days of Advent's all about, the hope of what's coming, and then Christmas Day. But even the 12 days of Christmas, we sing this song and all this stuff, but yet we're like, do we even really know what Epiphany is for the most of? There's more than just that day, right?
Yeah, I've been hugely obnoxious on Facebook every day. I post another Christmas song. I'm like, and on the 9th day of Christmas, don't let it go. Here's another Christmas song. We still have the tree up.
We do too. We still have the tree up. It's going to be up through January 6th. That's right. That's how we're doing it. So
yeah,
I love it.
So trying to keep that Christmas spirit going.
Good. So Kelly, before I introduce our special guest that's here with us, I do want to call out something. We're about to hit our 100th episode.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Isn't that amazing?
Counting down.
5 years, 100 episodes. So listeners, our folks, our beloved family that listens, we do have an extra special episode planned with a couple of folks that you might remember from our very first live event at St. John the Divine. That's the plan. But yeah, this has been an amazing journey, and I'm so excited that we're starting off 2025 with our awesome guest, Nicole Doyley. Hi, Nicole.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Welcome.
Absolutely. It's so great to have you on here. Now, I need to make an introduction for you, Nicole, because you've done a lot. And so I'm going to read a little bit from your website here. In fairness, folks, you can go, we'll have her web address, as we always do, where you can find out. But Nicole grew up in Brooklyn, You went to Dartmouth, where we just found out she stuck around around college there for about 20 years afterward in ministry and working at a church there. And then she found love and relocated to upstate New York. And then she found her way back down to Brooklyn, right?
No, I'm still in Rochester.
You're still in Rochester. Okay.
Late.
So you're there in upstate New York. So you've done a lot of things. You've written a lot of articles. You have a podcast that you do called Let's Talk, Conversations on Race, which is something that's beloved to me, especially being a person that grew up in, in a very white kind of society, like in the Midwest and stuff like that, where we didn't have these kinds of conversations because, gosh, we should never talk about race or anything else like that. And I'm glad that you have taken this on as a mantle, not so much as teaching me on what I should say, but it's a conversation we all need to have. And so I look forward to talking to you about that in this conversation. But also, we are going to talk about a book that you are about to release with Westminster John Knox called What About the Children?
That's right. That's exciting.
Excited to get into this conversation. So, Nicole, we always love to start off our conversations with our guests asking that one great question. Tell us about your spiritual life as a kid. What was it like growing up, and how did you form your faith that you have, or even get you on your journey?
Oh, I love that question. Nobody's ever asked me that before. It's kind of special to talk about it. Yeah.
Right on.
So yes, I grew up in Brooklyn and started out in the Baptist church, and through that church, they sort of sent kids to a Christian summer camp, and I went to that camp and accepted the Lord when I was 8, just always. And I remember being in my bed and praying my little 8-year-old prayers, and just, yeah, always felt like there was a God and felt very much drawn to him. And then when I was 14, my older sister decided she wasn't really interested in church anymore. And my mother thought, I got one teenager who's still interested in church, but I was beginning to find it a little boring because it was mostly old ladies in white gloves. And so she took it upon herself. My father was in the picture. It's just that my mom kind of led the way when it came to church. So my mom found in our neighborhood in Brooklyn a church. It was called All Saints Church. It was an Episcopal church. And the sort of descriptor was Full Gospel Anglican Church. And my mother was like, Full Gospel Anglican? How could that?
Wow.
That just seemed like an oxymoron to her.
No, right? Were they like dancing and doing miracles as well as the liturgy, or
in the middle of the liturgy as well?
Yeah.
Thanks to be God.
Exactly. Yes. So I was very much into piano and classical music. And so she checked it out without me the first time. And sure enough, they had the incense and the processional and all the readings and everything. And then the organist came down from the organ and sat at a piano and started singing praise music. And people started raising their hands.
That.
Oh my God, I want to go to this church. It sounds
Yeah.
like a great church.
So my mom was like, okay, my classical music oriented daughter will like the liturgy, but she's nevertheless a teenager who will also like the more upbeat music. So that's really where my faith took off. I had an older woman who mentored me, and we are still Christmas card friends. And I just wrote to her just how much of a miracle she was in my life. This tiny little 4'0" Puerto Rican lady with really high heels, Milka Gonzalez, who really took me under her wing and mentored me and discipled me.
God, what a beautiful story. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. And then when I went to college, because I had become, so serious about the Lord, I right away looked for a Christian group on the college campus, and my faith continued to grow.
Did your faith transform in college? I know a lot of people, when they get to college and they start getting exposed to different ideas, things can definitely change about their faith.
Well, yes, in an unexpected way. So, well, first of all, it was really important to be part of that student group there, because even in the Episcopal church, there weren't a lot of there was a very tiny youth group. So in college, it was really my first time worshiping with people my age. And okay, I'm not the only 18-year-old who believes this stuff. So, but the surprising way is that, it was a pretty conservative church. So I went from a very liberal home to a conservative church, to a liberal college to a conservative church. So, I would come home and spout ideas. Then my parents would be, my parents who were hippies would be like, "Who are you and what have you done with my daughter?" So most college kids become more liberal. I sort of
Right.
I became more conservative and then sort of settled somewhere in the middle.
Gotcha.
It was, it was the early 80s. So, Pat Robertson and the pro-life movement and Promise Keepers and all of that kind of stuff was very much part of the church culture.
Mm-hmm.
And that influenced you as well.
Yeah.
What a journey you've had. I think, Nicole, just looking over your bio here, your CV as it is, the book, What About the Children, is the one that's just coming out. But you also have 2 other books you've already published, When Life is Winter, with the subtitle of Navigating Seasons of Life, and then The Weight as well. As we dig in about our conversations, I want to make sure that we mention those as well in the work. What you went to Dartmouth for, you graduated with a
English.
writing degree, correct? English degree?
Yeah.
So did you always feel this call to be a writer?
To be a communicator, yes. I love words. I remember, even in high school, I lived in Brooklyn and went to high school in Manhattan. And even on the F train, the subway, reading my English homework, typical teenager doing it at the last minute, reading it on the subway. But I had a little pocket dictionary, this is before iPhones. I had a little pocket dictionary and I had looked up the words. So as I'm reading Jane Austen and Shakespeare and stuff, and like just these words were like delicious little chocolates to me. And I'd have to look it up and practice using them. And so
that's awesome. So you're a fellow word nerd.
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah. So
just-
right now,
so-
every dinner time, I teach my boys 2 new words.
That's
Oh,
awesome.
that's great.
So my favorite class in high school, and it was an elective class, it was semantics. Absolutely, my hands down, my favorite class. So I was one of those word nerds as well. Now, I never had the aspiration or the skill to be a writer, although, I mess with it today a little bit. I like your description of a communicator. That's what I was. But words matter. And that's what I love about that, especially when you know that, like when you said that you had your pocket dictionary, I was like, yes, right? Because you have to look up the word and what it means.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and the F train gives you a lot of time to do that, if I remember correctly. I lived in Brooklyn for a while, so.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I always sort of use the metaphor, like a painter, they're going to draw a sunset on the beach. They're going to be really deliberate about what colors to use to depict that sunset. They're not going to just be like, oh, any old red, any old yellow, any old orange. They're going to be really deliberate about those colors so that you could feel the sunset, And so I feel like words are like colors. Words for communicators, for speakers and writers are like colors for artists.
Do you ever, this is a just total writer question, do you ever find yourself distracted from like a moment like a sunset, where I find myself sometimes I'm looking at the sunset and I'm thinking like, how would I describe this? And it keeps me from like totally immersing in it because I'm thinking about how I'm going to tell somebody else about it.
Yeah, totally. Or I'm somewhere and somebody will say just one phrase and I'm like, I got to write about that. Just like one phrase will be like highlighted.
Totally.
Yeah.
So we should title this episode The Conversation of Word Nerds.
It sounds good.
Yeah, I like it.
Yeah.
So do you want to share a little bit about those first 2 books? What inspired you to write them, just so that our listeners know, in addition, what you've been up to. So we'll start off with When Life is Winter.
Yeah, that was actually a phrase. Well, no, I was asked to speak in a conference about different seasons of life, from Ecclesiastes, a time for more and a time, a time for every sun. And so I was asked to talk about, seasons of life. And so I gave that talk, and when I gave the talk, I realized I wasn't done thinking about it. And so I thought about it some more, and I just felt led to write a book. And most of the book, it talks about winter. So the title is When Life is Winter, although I do talk about the other seasons too. And just sort of using, physical winter as a metaphor of, during the winter, leaves come off the trees. The trees aren't beautiful. It looks dead. There's no flowers blooming. It's pretty colorless. At least I'm in Rochester, New York, so at least in the Northeast, it's colorless. And so and everything is sort of dormant. Trees aren't dead. They are alive, but they're dormant. They're not producing anything that is beautiful. They don't look fruitful. And so there's seasons like that in our lives too, where we're not highly productive, where we're not fruitful, where, there's nothing particularly beautiful to behold. And those could be times of going through something hard, a divorce, a death of a dream. I really thought I was going to get this job or, whatever, and it didn't happen. So many different things can trigger this sort of sense that it's winter, that everything is dormant, nothing is beautiful, and it's just hard. And really, and in a time like that, as Christians, our temptation could be that, well, God doesn't love me after all, or even, is there even a God, depending on how difficult the thing was that happened. And just encouraging readers, that's normal to feel, for it to be like, God, where are you? I mean, if you read the Psalms, David is always saying, why have you forsaken me? Where are you? But if we give ourselves over to that and just conclude there is no God, or God's doesn't love me, or the possibility of redemption is lost. Whereas if we cling to God, though the fig tree doesn't blossom, though there's no fruit on the vine, yet will I praise you, though you slay me, yet shall I hope in you, Job. If we have that, God, I don't get this, I don't understand why this happened, I don't feel you, I don't get it, this seems cruel, but I'm going to cling to you, then God could bring beauty from ashes. But if we just walk away from him, then sometimes that makes the winter season even colder and worse than it would have been. So that was that. And then the way I didn't get married till I was 40. So that's as much of my age as I'm going to give away.
Well, you're doing really well for yourself because you look like you're touching 40 now. So.
I have two teenagers. I'm not going to tell you their age, but I have two teenagers. So I didn't get married till I was 40, and I was in the church world, like you said, and in the church world is very hard on single people. It's a very married, the culture is very married and very family focused. And even churches will determine what you can and can't do, especially as a single woman, how much leadership you could have and all of that stuff. So, through those years, I wanted to be married. I wasn't somebody who, who cares? I'm content. I wasn't content at all. But, and temptations to settle for second best, maybe I can make this relationship work. And then deep inside thinking, I think that would be a mistake, and so the painfulness of relationships coming and going, but then God, bringing the man who I would marry, to practically to my doorstep, my church. And just so it's an encouragement to single women. The subtitle is encouragement for single women. The encouragement to single women is don't sell yourself short. Don't settle for second best. Draw near to God. For me, my single years felt like a long winter, drawing near to God, and that he's got good. I don't know what that good is for everybody, but that he has good, and that he wants us, and that he wants joy for us. So, yeah. And those two were self-published because I didn't have the bandwidth to pursue a traditional publisher. And then for this book that we'll talk about soon, I finally had the bandwidth to pursue a traditional publisher. So, yeah.
Well, it's a great way to put yourself out there because, self-published books in themselves, it tends to be like a look down upon or a diminishment of those. Not that you were doing that, of course, but people are like, oh, well, it wasn't good enough to get published by a publishing house. I was like, that's not true at all. It is anybody that's been through the process. It is not an easy process. Let me speak only by watching others go through it. And I might go through it myself as I'm working on a project, but it's like, holy smokes. Like, you have to be willing to sacrifice and give over your creativity if you're going to go mainstream like that. Now, granted, you happen to select what I think is an awesome publishing group to work with, Westminster John Knox, because, we've seen, other authors that we've interviewed through the group and then what they put out there in the world. I'd like to think that they're more collaborative in nature, but I'm happy that you've done what you've done. So, well, that said, I guess let's talk about what about the children?
Okay.
So, well, tell us about this book, like as if we've never heard about it.
Where do I jump in? Okay, so I think sometimes the thing that causes us the most angst can become a well from which others can drink. For me, well, it was singlehood for a long time. That's the first book. But for me, the biggest source of angst in my life was being biracial. And so my father is deceased, but he was Black. My mother is still living. She just turned 90 and she's white. They met in the early 1960s when it was still illegal in half the country for them to marry. They met in Colorado Springs where my father was in the military. But they dated. And while they were dating, they happened to meet a biracial young man. And actually, after my father had proposed, and my mother basically said, I'll think about it. The thing that no man wants to hear. What? You're like,
back to you on that.
Yeah, right. The worst, the second worst possible answer. So she had said, I'll think about it. And they met a young biracial man. And my mother's question to him basically is, what about the children? How did you fare being biracial? And he said, well, if your kids are loved, they'll be fine. And so my mother basically said, well, I know I'm going to love my kids. So she finally said yes to my dad. And the truth is that I was loved very much, but love was not enough. So my book really came out of, as much as I make it clear in my introduction, my goal is not to throw my parents under the bus. They did love me. They provided for me. My childhood was not tragic by any means, but at the same time, there were some important things missing, just some wisdom and intentionality that I wish they had in raising me and my sister, although I'll speak for myself, raising me. So you could say, well, that was back then and things have changed. And well, the truth is the mixed race population is the largest growing demographic, but things really haven't changed. When people do surveys about how these mixed race kids are faring in the world, there's a higher rate mental illness, anxiety, depression, in some cases suicide, in some cases substance abuse. So even though somebody like me is not as rare as I was back in the day, there's still, I think in a lot of cases, parents still have that idea, as long as I love my kid, that'll be enough, without realizing, but you also need wisdom, because these kids are moving through the world very differently from the way you did, from either parent. And they have to answer the question, what are you, and stuff like that. And it could be very easy to feel like you have one foot in two different worlds, but at the same time, you don't belong in either world. So it could be very lonely and isolating.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask, when you talk about that wisdom, what are some of the elements of what you would recommend parents teach their kids, their biracial children?
I think for Christian parents, one of the negative tendencies might be to say, as long as my kids know who they are in Christ, as long as their Christian identity is intact, that they are children of God, bought with a price, inheritance in heaven, all those good scripture verses, as long as they know that, then that's the only important thing. But the truth is that, so it's sort of a colorblind philosophy. And I think
Mhm.
even non-Christian parents could have a colorblind philosophy, but for Christian parents to realize, yes, of course, those spiritual parts of their identity are the most important things, but at the same time, they're not floating through the world without a body. They have a
Right.
body, and that body has a color and other ethnic features, and that is consequential. It's wonderful, and it's also consequential. So a child's color or other ethnic features shouldn't be ignored or evaded, but it's part of and so we know that race is a social construct, that race was constructed as sort of the America's version of a caste system, with
Mhm.
white people on top, black people
Yes.
on the bottom, and everybody else in between. The American caste system. So race as a concept was constructed, but ethnicity is not a construct. Ethnicity was God's idea. It says in the book of Acts that God created the ethnos, the nations. And with that, somebody from Nigeria, because they get a lot of sun, need a lot of melanin to protect them from the sun. And, God in his wisdom and, knew that Nigerians would need more melanin than Swedes, people from Sweden who don't get to see the sun very much.
Two
And-
good examples of Northern Europeans right here. Yes.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. When I look at ancestry.com, it's all like within
It's all up at the
100
doors.
miles
Yes.
of the United Kingdom.
Right. So ethnicity is not a negative human construct that we should get rid of. Ethnicity is part of God's plan. And with ethnicity comes a beautiful heritage and beautiful culture. So for somebody like myself who is white and black, for me to have learned, and my parents didn't teach me, these are things that I didn't learn until I went away to college and began to read and everything else. For me to learn, for parents to teach their kids at a younger age, your forefathers, on your father's side, were taken from Africa. But before that, even before they were taken from Africa, before the Europeans arrived in Africa, Africa was full of complex, sophisticated, wealthy empires. Africa was not a continent full of poverty and AIDS. It's not today just that, but especially before colonization, it was not that.
Because colonization is what destroyed the majority of that. Correct.
Right.
That's
Like
part of the oppression. Yes.
Yeah, the empires in Africa were wealthier in many cases than Europe. So to first learn that, and then learn so that there's this sense of pride. Okay, this is my forefathers. We're parts of these kingdoms. And then they survived what the Middle Passage was, and the fact that they survived and that they survived slave plantations, and they taught themselves to read, and they, migrated to the north to find to escape Jim Crow. And so learning those things to ground me in a pride for my African American heritage, and teaching a child that, because the time will come when they experience racism, they'll experience the negative. But before they have an opportunity to experience the negative, to be grounded in pride for the positive.
Absolutely. Give them good context to all that. And I agree. I love how you're taking this. It's, did you write the book for your two sons? Were they the ones that were in mind?
Not just, certainly partly, but not just. Yeah. And I did think of my sons a lot, even though my husband is Jamaican. So I often think of them as Black, even though they have a white grandmother, but we live in a very white community, in a very white school district. And so I often think about their racial identity development, even though there's not necessarily the biracial aspect. But at the same time, it is still true that we're still fighting to have, I could count on one hand the number of Black authors that they have read in school. And so as parents, making sure that we're providing Black authors for them to read during school breaks. And the same thing with Black heroes. Rather, of course, they're going to learn about Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, and that's wonderful. but there's far more than that.
Yeah,
And
there's the everyday folks who live their lives being the unsung heroes, just being the
yes,
courageous souls.
And there's inventors and military heroes and
yes,
politicians and all
yes.
this history that
Yeah, I mean, like
that you
let's
don't
start with John
necessarily
Lewis. I mean,
learn
here's
in
a good
school. Yeah.
person that up there too. So let me ask you a question because I'm fascinated by your book now that, as you're unwrapping it for us here of what its purpose is. This sounds like a book that should be read by all children, regardless of where, what your heritage or ethnicity is. Like, it opens that door because, as I said at the top of this, I grew up in the Midwest in Missouri in a town that was predominantly white, right? And in my graduating class, this is some years ago, but there was over 600 people and there were like 3 black kids in my entire graduating class. Like,
Yeah.
like, so race wasn't even discussed. I mean, I was friends with them, but there's no context, no nothing. Like, and I was deprived of that. It's only through my own life experiences that had taught me, and going out into the world. But what if I just stayed in Missouri my life?
Yeah.
I wouldn't know any
Right.
different.
You might be one of those folks who are asking, why is everything about race? Like, didn't we fix that?
Exactly.
That's because I hear that. I grew up in a similar circumstance to Mark. And then halfway through high school, I grew up in Indiana. I moved to Baltimore. And when you grow up in a town that's primarily white, you think, oh, I'm not racist. I never got taught to be racist.
Right.
And then you go somewhere that's much more diverse. And you go, oh, there's a lot of quiet things that I picked up that I didn't even know I had.
Yes, yes. And so part of the wisdom for yes to the question, I think everybody should read the book because, our country, why are we still so dysfunctional when it comes to race? And,
Amazing, isn't it? Amazing
Yeah.
in a very bad way that we are so dysfunctional over this.
yes. And a lot of it is because we haven't faced some things. But part of the wisdom for parents is to build diverse communities. So, I said that we live in a very white school district, but we for a while we were attending a diverse church, but it was a diverse church that was white led. All the pastors were white, even though the congregation was very diverse. And we realized, other than my husband and I and people in books and some of our friends, we have, Black friends and other people of color in our lives, but they don't have any other leaders. They're not being influenced. All of their teachers are white. All of their principals are white. Everybody who is in a position of authority, other than my husband and I, in their life is white. And we realized that needs to change. So we actually moved to a Black-led church that is also diverse, but the leaders are Black this time. And that's very rare. It's very rare for white people to join Black-led churches, which is we could talk about that for another day.
Yeah, we could do a whole episode about that.
So for parents who are raising mixed race kids, and also I address in the book white parents who are raising transracially adopted kids, there are some similarities. You can no longer afford to live in a homogeneous world because it's just not fair to the kid. And I talk about cultural racism and the fact that even, you could be giving them the books and watching great movies about important people of color and all of those things, where our culture, however, the water that we're swimming in is still polluted with racism. So, for example, I was, having some mother-son bonding time and watching a police series with one of my sons. And after 6 or 7 episodes, I said to him, hey, what color are the bad guys usually?
No, board.
And they were usually Black or Hispanic. And they were usually drug cartels or, drug dealers or whatever. And when I said to him, do you know that in America, white and Black people use and sell drugs at the same rate? He was like, really? And, and how sad that because that's what we're fed. That's what we're fed in the media. That's what we're fed in Hollywood. All the drug dealers are Black,
Black or brown. Exactly.
Brown, but in reality, that's not the case.
Of course not. But it doesn't work in a white-led world because it doesn't fit a narrative really well. It's just like, again, where Kelly and I grew up anytime I go back to where my mom, she still lives back in Missouri, you can drive through there and I see plenty of the people that are on the drugs and the other, it's, oh gosh, it's the white folk that nobody wants to talk about though, of course, right? Because they're in the way or whatever. My point in all of that is it doesn't fit the media narrative or what is in popular culture.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And another thing I said to them, because, you can't, kids are going to observe things. So,
Of course.
so if we drive through an upper middle class white suburb and all the houses are nice and the lawns are nice and everybody mowing the lawn is white, and then they drive through an inner city area where it's not so beautiful and everybody's black or brown, they're going to conclude, they're going to make some assumptions. And so
there's no drugs going on in those middle class houses. Oh no, none whatsoever. No, that doesn't happen.
Right. Until you run around with a bunch of middle class white kids some Friday night, you realize
who were smoking pot every morning in the school parking lot before we went to school. But that's
right, exactly. Yeah, but also, I remember again when I told them, "Do you realize that there are more poor white people in this country than poor black people?" And they were like, "What?" Now, now I know because there's two different statistics. There's poverty rate and poverty numbers. In both cases, it's not what you think. So in sheer numbers, there's more poor whites than poor blacks. Black people are only 12% of the population, and all of us are not poor. So, but poor whites tend to be spread out in rural communities. And when poverty is spread out, it's harder to see.
Absolutely. That's why I say that about exactly where my mom lives in the part of Missouri that she does. It's all spread out, If you open your eyes, you see it. And it's in the tragedy is across the board. It becomes a colorless white, or a colorless lack of all ethnicity. The fact that we see this and we don't support these folks, regardless, that's the sad story of all of this, right? These are people who are trapped into scenarios that they cannot get themselves out of this. And now, granted, I'm going to go off on a rant because there's the ones that will say, well, you can always escape that. I'm like, I think it's as easy as that. People just immediately just pick up and say, I'm going to leave and I'm just going to pull myself up by the bootstraps and just go make myself an own life, right? That doesn't quite how that goes.
No, it's usually the wonder kid, whether it's in an inner city or a rural white community. The ones who get out are the wonder kids. They are geniuses. They are, whether literal or figuratively geniuses, they are motivated. They latch on to the one coach, the one person, and they just are determined. Amen. All their brothers are going nowhere. Their father is a drunk, but it doesn't matter. They're out. That takes a very special person. The majority of people to get out need a lot more help than that.
They do. It's so cliche to say, but it takes a community, it takes a village to lift this up. And we suck at this in our culture right now, and it's been going on for a long time, and it's not getting any better, it seems. So fast forward to the end of the book. What's the takeaway from the reader with What About Our Children? What about our children?
I think my conclusion is that kids have to be taught to identify with the race of both parents. So, part of our history is something called the one drop rule, which is that if you had quote unquote one drop of black blood or Asian blood or indigenous blood, if you had one drop, meaning somebody knew that your great-grandfather or great-grandmother, probably more likely be, was black, then you were black. Even if you got pale skin, straight hair, narrow British nose, but your great-grandmother was black, you're black. And it was just because you had to identify with the lowest person in the strata. And so, that came to be in the 1920s, when during segregation, like, okay, we got to, desire to keep the races separate, but in the occasion where they were mixed, okay, which world do they belong in? Well, your pure white blood has been tainted, so you're black. That's what comes out of white supremacy.
But they don't apply that to people who are descended from enslaved people who often find out that that there's white ancestors.
Right. There's a double standard
as well.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
sorry to interrupt.
No, right. The travesty of it is that not that white people are any more sinful than black people, of course not. But the reality was on plantations, it was white men raping black women because for a black
Yes,
man,
there's that.
for a black man to rape a white woman would have been torture and death. You know, they would have just never done it. So the reason for the light brown kids on slave plantations was not because of black rape; it was because of white rape. So the race mixing quote happened because of that, and even into Jim Crow and stuff, it happened because of that. But this idea of the one drop rule sort of stayed with us for a long time because it was always said, well, if you look black, you better be raised to identify as black because everybody's going to treat you like black. Or if you're white and Asian, if you have Asian features, we better raise you to just identify as Asian because everybody's going to treat you that way. And so that really sewed into kids. You have to deny one of your parents. Only one. You're only identifying with one side of your family, and yet, like in my case, I do look more black than white, but I do have a white mom. Growing up, I had a white mom who introduced me to classical music, and I fell in love with classical music, and so that's part of me. And yet, the black kids that I grew up with just couldn't handle that. They were like, that's for white folks, But then the white kids that I hung out with, especially as we became teenagers, made it very clear that I wasn't white. So it's like, okay, I don't really belong anywhere. So the conclusion is if your kids need to be intentionally taught the beauty of both sides of the family. So if they are Korean and white, they need to know their grandma immigrated from Korea after the war, and she arrived speaking no English, and she was so brave, and she did this, and to give us a better life, and this is what your grandma went through, and this is what Korea was before the war, and what Korea is now, and this is Korean food, and Korean language, and Korean culture, and to be proud of that, but at the same time to also be proud, if Dad is like you guys, from Northern European roots, that to be proud of that too. Your grandfather fought in World War II and, whatever, can boldly step into both parts of their heritage. And they will encounter people who act like gatekeepers of culture, like the Korean table that says, well, you're not really Korean because you only know a few words of Korean. Well, yes, I do belong here because my mother is Korean, and and I understand the culture and I love the culture, and I'm working on my Korean, and I do belong at this table, so I'm going to sit down, and the same thing with the white table, or whatever, to boldly, they have a place at the table. They're not imposters at either table. But to not be imposters, they have to know the culture. They can't sit at the Korean table and they know nothing about Korean culture, because then they are imposters.
Well said. Wow, well said. So again, your latest book, What About the Children, coming out in February 18th. You can pre-order it now. I see already on Amazon and through your website as well. So congratulations on your third book. I hope it is wildly successful and indeed fulfills your mission that every person gets a chance to read this and look at this, whether or not they have come from a biracial background, because we don't live, as you so well put it, we don't live in a homogenous society, right? This is our culture. This is our brothers and sisters and everything in between. The more we embrace the reality, the better off we are as a culture, that's for sure. So Thank you, Nicole.
Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure being on. I love talking about this stuff. You guys made it easy.
Well, we would love to talk more. There are so many different avenues that we could go with this, and a lot more wisdom we're sure that you have to share. So we hope that you'll come back sometime soon.
Yeah, I'd love to have you back, Nicole.
Anytime.
Thank you again.
All right. Thank you.
Happy New Year.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Radical Love Live, hosted by Mark Dilcom and Kelly Wilson. Recorded at the Bravery Studios in Garfield, New Jersey. All rights reserved. Find our episodes on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube. And check us out at radicallovelive.com, along with our personal websites at markdilcom.com and kellywilson.com. This is Radical Love Live, where we explore faith outside the boxes.
If you've ever deconstructed your faith, you know it's not easy. But just imagine if you could have people to guide you through your process. People like Jim Palmer, Kristen Dumais, Jennifer Knapp, Brad Jerzak, Brian Zand, Paul Young, and more. Well, if you head over to www.choiracademy.com and register for Square 2 using the promo code RAD, you'll get 10% off the regular registration cost of this awesome course and community just for being a fan of our show.